All right, so today we're tackling the story of Montenegro. And let me tell you, for such a small country, its history is absolutely epic. We're talking about a place that stood up to empires, played a huge role in modern history. It's really a story all about survival, identity, and just this fierce independence.
So when you picture Montenegro today, you probably think of, this stunning paradise on the Adriatic coast, right? An amazing tourist spot. But that calm, beautiful image, it hides a seriously turbulent past. I mean, this is a country that spent centuries staring down empires and just refusing to be conquered. It was a hotbed of anti-fascist resistance, and it even produced some of the 20th century's most famous political dissidents. So the real question is, how? How did this tiny nation end up playing such a massive role in history? Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start way back with its ancient roots, then see how this unique nation was forged. After that, we'll dive into its really crucial and often painful role in Yugoslavia. Then we'll look at its path to independence and wrap up by asking, what's next? All right, let's kick things off way back in antiquity and look at the tribes and empires that first left their mark on this rugged land and its, incredibly resilient people. So way back, long before it was even called Montenegro, this was the land of Illyrian tribes. Then, around 168 BC, everything changes. Rome's legions arrive, and that's the start of centuries of Roman rule. They even set up a whole province here called Privolitana. But, empires rise and fall. Eventually, the Roman era fades, and a new group arrives on the scene in the 6th century, the Slavic tribes. And their arrival, well, it would change the destiny of the entire region forever. And we're not talking about some minor outpost here. The Roman influence was huge. Their capital city, Duklja, was a serious urban center. We're talking an estimated 40,000 people at its peak. Think about that for an ancient city. It had everything: paved streets, temples, advanced water systems. Its legacy was so powerful that the medieval state that came later, Duklja, was actually named after this very city. Okay, so as we move into the medieval era, something new starts to emerge from the ashes of the Roman world. A distinct Slavic identity, a new state, begins to form. But from day one, it was a fight for survival against much bigger neighbors. And this is what I find so fascinating. Montenegro's history isn't just about battles and warfare. Get this, in 1494, while the Ottoman Empire is literally sweeping across the Balkans, what are they doing? The local dynasty sets up a printing house in their mountain capital, and they produce the very first printed book among all the South Slavs. I mean, think about that. It's an absolutely incredible cultural achievement for a state that's basically surrounded and under constant threat. So, the big question is, how did they resist for so long? How did they manage to hold out? Well, a huge part of the answer is this really unique political role, the Vladika. It's basically a prince-bishop. For centuries, one dynasty held both spiritual power as head of the church and political power as the ruler. This mashup created this unified state that was strong enough to rally all these fiercely independent clans together and maintain this stubborn, incredible autonomy against the Ottomans. All right, now we're jumping into the 20th century, and this is where things get incredibly intense for Montenegro. This is a period of massive transformation. The country becomes part of the new state of Yugoslavia, it makes unbelievable sacrifices, and it turns into a literal battleground for some of the biggest ideological fights of the entire century. And if you want to understand Montenegro's outsized impact, just look at this. It's stunning. During World War II, Montenegrins were only about 2% of the total Yugoslav population. Tiny, right? But get this. They made up an incredible 36% of all the generals in Tito's anti-fascist partisan army. 36%! That massive contribution to winning the war is exactly why they became a core, respected nation in the new socialist Yugoslavia. But in a wild twist of fate, that same fighting spirit, that same desire for freedom, was about to turn inward. And this quote really sets the stage. It's from a man named Milovan Djilas, a Montenegrin war hero, one of Tito's best friends, and a guy who would go on to become the entire Eastern Bloc's most famous dissident. His words are basically the calm before the ideological storm. You have to understand, Djilas wasn't some outsider. He was one of the main architects of the new Yugoslavia. But then, by the early 1950s, he starts looking around and fiercely criticizing the very system he helped create. His big argument? He said the Communist Party bosses had become a new class, basically a new elite, an oligarchy that was abusing its power, and had totally lost touch with the people. And for saying that, well, he was kicked out of the party and thrown in prison for years.
Now, Gelsa's personal struggle was really just a symptom of a much larger, brutal crackdown. See, back in 1948, Tito had his famous split with Stalin, and right after, a massive purge of anyone even suspected of being pro-Soviet swept to the country. And it hit Montenegro harder than anywhere else. Why? Well, because of deep historical and cultural ties to Russia, Montenegrins were seen as particularly suspect. The result? About 5,000 of them were arrested.
Okay, let's really put that number into perspective, because 5,000 might not sound like a lot, but for Montenegro, that was more than 1% of the entire population at the time. Just stop and think about that. 1 out of every 100 people in the whole country was arrested. This was a profound trauma for such a small society, and it literally pitted families against families, clans against clans, in this huge ideological battle. So all of this brings us toward the end of the 20th century and the violent, tragic collapse of Yugoslavia. For Montenegro, this was a really tricky time. It was all about navigating a very difficult alliance with Serbia before, finally, making the choice to go its own way. So at first, as Yugoslavia broke apart, Montenegro stuck with Serbia in a new, smaller federation. But the real turning point came in 1997. That's when the leadership started to make a very strategic pivot, slowly distancing the country from Milosevic's government in Belgrade. It was a decade of careful political chess, and it all led up to a huge, historic referendum in 2006 to decide once and for all what the future would be.
And the result, I mean, it could not have been closer. Independence passed with just 55.5% of the vote. And you have to know the EU had set this really high bar of 55% to even recognize it. They just barely scraped by. This chart really shows you just how split the country was at that moment. And that division between those who wanted independence and those who wanted to stay with Serbia, it's something that still shapes the country's politics to this day.
And just like that, after centuries and centuries of struggle, Montenegro was its own independent country again. So let's take a look at where that path has led in the 21st century. So where is Montenegro today? Well, it has planted its flag firmly in the West. It joined NATO back in 2017, and it's an official candidate for the European Union. The economy is all about tourism, which has made the coastline really developed and beautiful, but it's also created this big economic gap between the coast and the poorer, less developed north.
Which really brings us back to the big picture, doesn't it? When you look at its whole history, the story of Montenegro has always been about navigating its place between bigger powers, squeezed between East and West, balancing these different identities. So I guess the ultimate question for this small nation with such a gigantic history is this: can it finally, after all this time, carve out a stable, prosperous, and truly unique path all its own?